The British rhomboid trench crawlers are the primogenesis of all tanks. The Renault FT-17 may be considered the grandparent of all modern tanks due to its layout, and experts weeaboos and teaboos will argue for days on which is the first main battle tank. But it's the Carden-Loyd tankette that I believe should be considered the foundation of the global tank industry. Some of you may be asking why I think that, but many more will be asking what it even is. For unfortunately, not many know of it, or only know of it in passing as a bit of background for one of their favourite tanks, which is an injustice considering how this tiny vehicle would have a big impact. So come with me on this multi-part series where I will tell you about its service across the globe and how the tank industries of several nations came about due to it. But first, I think you should get to know its history, a story that, like most of Britain's greatest mechanical creations, begins with one man in a shed. So which is it, I hear you ask? John Carden or Vivian Lloyd? Neither. The gentleman in question is one Major Gifford Le Quesnel Martel. I believe that's how it's pronounced. Sometimes simply known as Q. And before you ask, no, he is not the inspiration for the James Bond character of the same name. Martel served in the Royal Engineers during the First World War, which is where he first experienced the tank and fell in love with its potential. He later theorised that instead of one big tank that would require several crewmen to operate, who would probably all be killed when hit by anti-tank weaponry, a swarm of smaller one-man armoured vehicles, each armed with a machine gun, could just as effectively break through the enemy lines, whilst being more difficult to hit. Now, to be fair, that is an oversimplification. There is a lot more to this idea, but this was the one aspect he focused on. After the war, he went on to develop a modular box girder bridge, patented as the Martel Bridge, which entered service with the British Army in 1925. That same year, he would start work on building his one-man tank. To save money and help entice the Army investing in it, he chose to use as many commercially available parts as he could. In his garage, which actually was on a turntable, I don't know how that worked, he would Frankenstein together the engine from a Maxwell car, the drive shaft of a Model T Ford, the tracks from Roadless Traction Limited, and the wheels off a Federal truck to act as a stabilising tail as well as steering the vehicle. By August he had finished a wooden mock-up, carefully weighted to simulate being an actual armoured vehicle. He would then conduct test runs through the countryside around where he lived. These revealed several issues that would need to be addressed. However, the area he happened to live in was the town of Camberley, which is also where the Army Staff College is located. Inevitably, an outing in the machine was spotted by one of the officers there, that gentleman being Captain B.H. Littleheart, who immediately wrote an article about what he witnessed for the Daily Telegraph. The man fantasised about this vehicle, seeing it as the second coming of heavy cavalry, bulletproof knights with a machine gun lance. Of course, this sudden publicity brought interest, and shortly after, he would be running demonstrations in front of the members of the War Office. Seeing promise in the concept, they would go on to order 4 prototype vehicles to conduct further tests with. Upon Martel's recommendation, this task would be given to Morris Commercial, a subsidiary of Morris Motors that built vans and taxis. This would result in it getting a slight engine upgrade, with a 16 horsepower engine produced by Morris Commercial. And yes, this was an upgrade. First, economically, the makers of the original engine, Maxwell, had been bought out by Chrysler, and it would have had to be shipped in from the United States anyway. Secondly, the RAC horsepower rating was outdated. Nearly all British engines from this time are reported as being weaker than they actually are. Yes, I'm segueing here, but I went down this rabbit hole, and by damn, I'm bringing something back from it. Don't worry, I'll keep it short. So here is the simple formula that the RAC created in the early 1910s to calculate the power of an engine in order for the government to properly tax it. This is to take the diameter of the bore, times it by itself, and the number of cylinders, then divide it by 2.5. This was fine for 1914, but by the mid-20s it was obsolete. Despite this, it still lasted till the late 1940s. It resulted in the 20 horsepower Model T Ford being taxed at 22 horsepower, and the Austin 7, named such due to its 7 horsepower tax rating, providing over 10. Eventually, manufacturers would start naming their cars with two numbers, the first being its tax rating and the second being its actual. For example, the 1923 Wolseley 2430, rated at 24 horsepower, but churning out 30. And it got stupider, with the 1938 Wolseley 1460 being more than 4 times its taxable output. Now why is any of this relevant? Because I went looking to see if this engine was used in anything else. And of course it was. It was used in their trucks, their taxis, and even a Morris car, the Morris Oxford Empire, of which the 1928 model was called the 1640. So when I say it was a 16 horsepower engine that was to be put into the Morris Martel tankettes, this is only its taxable rating, and it probably produced double that. Anyway, with that tangent aside, let's continue. The order that the War Office had put in was actually for 2 different vehicles. The first was to be the one-man tankette, but the other was to be a 2-man version. It's here that the designers and engineers at Morris Commercial got a bit cheeky. Instead of creating 2 completely different vehicles, they would make an armoured hull for each configuration that could be attached to one universal chassis. As much as this interchangeability may sound like a good bit of cost-saving ingenuity, their motives were a bit more cunning. Not only did they plan on selling the chassis with whichever armoured hull the military wanted fitted, but also to sell the chassis with an unarmoured body on it to the public as a tractor. For those still wondering how all this is cheeky, remember, this is a military-funded project. All that R&D, material costs, and potential production line setup for which Morris wouldn't have to spend a penny. The first of the prototypes would be ready for February of 1926. This would be the one-man hull built with 8mm of mild steel. Coming in at 3 tons, the engineers immediately set about redesigning the chassis in order to reduce this to its original 2-ton projected weight. This would be achieved by reducing the armour thickness to 6mm, a rather counterproductive move, as it rendered the vehicle vulnerable to anything other than pistol fire. It was also unnecessary, as testing would show that the 3 tons was hardly a big issue, and so the decision was reversed. The 2-man hull was just a widened version of the 1-man. Due to the need to be compatible with a universal chassis, the steering wheel was in the centre of the crew compartment. Whilst this meant it could be steered by both the driver and the gunner, in an age without power-assisted steering, the driver would have a hard time turning the wheel away from him if the gunner was busy. Strangely, for a British vehicle, it was left-hand drive. That's not the only strange thing about the vehicle. As I mentioned earlier, the wheels at the back were part of its steering system. Their main purpose was to prevent the vehicle from tipping backwards when ascending steep slopes, but Martel had designed them to assist with turning the vehicle. Like other tracked vehicles of the time, it was steered by applying the brakes on one side. This would of course slow the vehicle down, and as things like differentials weren't commonplace at the time, caused significant wear to the drive system. However, on hard surface and roads, it could use these wheels instead, making it, in a sense, a kind of backwards half-track. While this allowed the tankette to retain more of its speed when making small turns, any tight cornering would require some track braking. It also didn't work very well on muddy or loose terrain. Despite its theoretical benefits, this additional system was extra weight and quite complicated. And I say theoretical, it was later thought that it was actually making the steering more difficult. So a single trailing wheel was experimented with, eventually being dropped from the base chassis intended for civilian tractor tests. The second pair of prototypes would differ in their running gear, by having a sprocketed drive wheel instead of a disc type. Further trials were conducted throughout 26, and the War Office came to the conclusion that the single-man type was just too impractical. Imagine this scenario taking place on the fields of Flanders. The poor driver having to dodge craters too deep for the vehicle to handle, or trying to avoid colliding with the other tankettes of his squad. On top of which, they would only have one hand on the wheel, as the other is firing the MG, and now they have to change gear. It's the same issue that the French commander in his one-man turret had, but dialed up to 11. It's for this reason that they would place a new order for 8 2-man machines in December. These were to be used in next year's manoeuvres by the Experimental Mechanised Force. They wouldn't be alone though. The publicity from Little Heart's article may have grabbed the attention of the military, but it also drew the eye of potential competitors. One of these, of course, was the dynamic duo of John Valentine Carden and Vivian Graham Lloyd. Both former captains in the British Army, their shared interest in engineering would bring them together at some point early in the decade, forming Carden-Loyd Tractors Limited. Carden would be the chief engineer, whilst Lloyd handled the business and marketing, as they developed tracked vehicles fit for the military. They had the idea of a small vehicle intended for reconnaissance, and after the article must have thought that this is the most opportune moment to present it to the military. Little is documented on this first machine they demonstrated. What is known is the engine was situated between the driver's legs, and that the tracks were rather crude with no suspension. On soft ground it was fine, but was rough going for the driver on anything hard. However, it had shown enough potential for a refined model to be asked for. This would be delivered in March of 26. The Model T engine had been moved fully to the rear, extending the length. The crude tracks, based on an industrial conveyor, were still present but had been strengthened, extending their service life from 20 miles to 80. This was also partially due to the addition of some basic suspension that would also help it achieve speeds of 20 miles per hour. It was still very bare bones though. It would be fitted mudguards the next month, but wouldn't get a body fitted till the end of June. At some point after, the first 2 prototypes would arrive. These were further refined models of the testbed with extended track frames. They also had a small half-turret mounted on a ring around the driver's position, the front of which, as you can see, tapers to form an armoured snout around the stripped-down Lewis gun. I'm going to be honest, it kind of looks like a duck. A polygonal duck. And since I've seen it now, I must share my pain. It's the Polygon tank. Don't judge me, I was a Pokemon kid. Anyway, let's move on. The turret was capable of 360 traverse, although due to having to drive the vehicle whilst firing the gun, the pilot would be limited to just a narrow frontal arc whilst advancing. An additional benefit, though, was that the turret could be turned rearwards, giving the driver a greater unobstructed view while travelling. The tracks were now cast, and initially the suspension consisted of each side having 10 small rollers on small coil springs. This was later replaced by a set of 4 unsprung rubber-rimmed rollers. Later, in 27, one of them would have an experimental header fitted to its engine in hopes of increasing its power output. The result was a whopping 0.5 horsepower more. Another prototype was delivered in early August. It was pretty much the same as the others, except for the addition of a wheel-cum-track system. With a pneumatic tired wheel mounted to each side, being powered by a chain connected to the drive sprocket, and a single solid wheel at the back that would provide steering, resulted in a unique but unusual tricycle arrangement. This would be followed up by another at the end of the same month. This one was completely different, for it was a 2-man tankette. Before I go into it, I have a brief aside. Some of you may know this version as the Mark IV, and the other 1-man models being the Mark I, 1 star, 2 and 3. If you're wondering why I haven't specified which of these vehicles is which, well, it's because none of them were actually given these designations. This convention was started later, and it doesn't help that there's no consensus on what the differences between each of them are. For instance, I've seen it claimed that the wheel-cum-track model is the Mark I star, as it has the same running gear as the Mark I, despite it being the last of the 1-mans to be delivered. Other sources claim that the 1 star had an engine boost, and different tracks to the Mark I. This correlates with the second vehicle that got the experimental header. The Mark II is said to have a different suspension to the Mark I. It is documented that the 4-wheel running gear didn't come until later. Even then, it wasn't unheard of for a chassis to have the 10-roller suspension on one side and the 4 unsprung on the other. These vehicles were constantly being tinkered with and experimented on with new tracks made from different materials. So when it comes down to the Mark Is to 3, there is no definitive answer. It is all a blur that may not exist. As for the so-called Mark IV, the 2-man crew sat either side of the vehicle, with the engine between them. Driver on the left, gunner on the right. This arrangement allowed the vehicle to be much lower and half the weight of the Morris Martel. It was wider, but that only helped in making it a more balanced vehicle. The front plate had 3 slots cut into it. On the gunner's side, this would be where the stripped-down Lewis gun would be mounted. As for the other 2, we don't know. Many theories have been put forward, but remember, this is just a prototype, they were still experimenting. There was another plate mounted above this, at an angle, to give a bit more protection to the crew, although their heads were still exposed. The gap left between the 2 would provide vision for them when they ducked their heads down when under fire. Now altogether, the 4 prototype Carden-Loyds and the 4 Morris Martels would show off later that year at the Dominion premieres. The staged performance would feature the 8 tankettes running alongside the Vickers A1E1 Independent that towered over its miniature kin. There was a small incident. where one of the single-main Cardens got hit by a Martel, resulting in its turret being dislodged, and the driver having to push it off, continuing the show without it. Naturally, the press were enthralled by the display of these tiny machines, and naturally, they all became defence experts overnight, writing entire columns on how the army intended to use them. All of which were completely different, owing to the fact they were all completely bollocks. And I'll tell you why later. The one thing that they did do is give the two-man Carden-Loyd a new name: the Honeymoon Tank. After a brief refit, the Honeymoon would return to the Mechanised Warfare Experimental Establishment, who were evaluating the vehicles. They had swapped the 10-man roller suspension with the solid 4 wheels, and equipped it with a revised version of the wheel-cum-track system, this time having the central tricycle wheel be the same size as the two on the sides. This layout was found satisfactory enough for the MWEE to order 8 of them for the upcoming manoeuvres. These would join the 8 Morris Martels, both being used in testing out how such vehicles could be used, as well as also pitting them against each other in order to find out which was better. The Carden-Loyd contract had been signed in March of 27, whilst Morris Martel had received their 8-vehicle order back in December of 26. Despite this early lead on their rivals, not everything was right in the camp. Martel was having second thoughts over the design of their machine. Back in February of 27, he started making proposals for the current project to be scrapped, and a new design, similar to what Carden-Loyd were creating, to be drawn up. At the same time, Morris was coming to the conclusion that the chassis was not suitable for agricultural work. Q didn't want to carry on with the project, and was open for another engineer to take it up, but Morris Commercial was disinterested in continuing it anyway. The order would be fulfilled, but Morris and Major Martel chose to go their separate ways. This final batch of tankettes had an extended set of trailing wheels. This helped with its trench crossing capability, something that was still held in high regard, as well as improving its stability. However, even if it turned out to be the better of the two, without a builder or engineer to continue working on it, the Morris Martel's development had come to an end. Before the trials had begun, the Carden-Loyd had won. Or had it? Martel wasn't done with the one-man tankette idea. He had earlier argued that if a cavalryman can control his horse while aiming his lance, then a man can drive a tankette and fire the MG. Now we can all see the flaws in that, but he would continue by pointing out that an aircraft's pilot seems to manage it. Oh boy. Q. You're not an idiot, but my god, that's stupid. Firstly, a pilot doesn't so much as aim the guns, which are in a fixed position on the aircraft, but more aim the aircraft. Something easily doable when not only can you control the horizontal axis, known as the yaw, but the vertical axis as well, also called pitch. That last bit proves to be difficult for a land vehicle due to something known as the ground. Secondly, when a plane is in the air, it doesn't usually have to worry about things like obstacles or terrain. Yes, I am John Dudley North of Bolton Pool Aircraft. It is better to have a dedicated driver and a dedicated gunner with an aimable weapon on a ground Wait a minute. Oh no. No. Oh god, no! Anyway, Martel had first approached Roadless Traction Limited to begin a new project, but they would turn him down. Instead, he would acquire the assistance of Crossley Motors, who had already had some experience with armoured and half-tracked vehicles. They would take the chassis of one of their 1500-weight Kegrise half-tracks, turn it around, and build an armoured one-man hull on it. The result was, essentially a mid-engined Morris Martel. Despite wanting to make something more like the Carden-Loyd, he had somehow ended up with a slightly worse alternative than what he had made before. The Crossley Martel was a more comfortable ride, and with the weight distribution shifted rearwards, could steer better too. This came at the slight cost of some traction. A major flaw was the fact the tracks would kick up a lot of dust into the engine, severely reducing its life to only 1,000 miles. It had its evaluation trial in March, where it was found to be worse at trench crossing than its predecessor by half. That was only a minor issue though. Its final report in October made note of how overloaded the suspension was, and thus they ended it. This is where Gifford Q. Martel's part in the tale ends, and so does the original idea of the tankette, as the experimental mechanised force intended to use its 16 tankettes for cross-country reconnaissance. He would continue trying to make one-man vehicles later on. These include his tricycle canoe thing that would be nicknamed Martel's Mechanical Coffin. Then, while serving in India, now as a colonel, He created this 4-tracked articulated beast with the engine all the way at the top of it. He was an interesting fellow to say the least. Back with the vehicle that this video is actually about. A new feature was about to be added. The stripped-down Lewis gun was replaced by a Vickers machine gun, a weapon much more suited for firing at medium ranges from a stationary position. The platform's role was now clear. It was to be a weapon carrier, delivering the crew to a position, dismounting and setting up the MG. Its use on the vehicle itself would only be in an emergency. This change was more prevalent on the 8 production models that arrived with the tripod mounted on them. With this finalisation, the creators decided to give it a name, the Carden-Loyd Mark V, simultaneously giving it an identity and confusing researchers who are wondering what Marks 1 to 3 are, as I mentioned earlier. They were far from being the final products though. In testing, they were notoriously unreliable, breaking down wherever they liked. The cause of most of the troubles was easy to determine, the wheel-cum-track system. The drive wheels that stuck out from the side would get caught on anything and everything. Rocks, bushes, fence posts that the driver had misjudged the distance from. It wasn't helped that the chain that powered them off the drive gear was completely exposed, allowing all matter of dirt and detritus getting lodged in the works. The lack of suspension didn't help either, as every bump and rut was transferred into the machine. The tracks, however, were beginning to shine though, with new metallurgy greatly extending their wear life. It was quite quickly concluded that the system was useless, and it would be dropped from the later production Mark Vs. They would go on to produce a good number of these, since the loss of their competition had netted them increasingly large orders. Orders so great that a small company would not be able to handle it without the help of God. Okay, that's an exaggeration. They would just need some Vickers. In March of 1928, Carden-Loyd Tractors Limited would become a part of Vickers Armstrong, with the two designers quickly becoming some of their greatest employees. By this time, the two had already been experimenting with the flexibility of the chassis, first designing a smokescreen crater variant, followed by a slightly revised model fitted with a 0.5-inch Vickers heavy machine gun. Like other Mark Vs, it had 4 to 8mm of armour, a crew of 2, with the driver on the left and a gunner on the right. Between them would sit the 20.5 horsepower Ford Model T engine, with a radiator mounted behind it. There were armoured doors right at the back that could be opened for better cooling. The power from the engine went through its 2-speed gearbox to the front axle, also from a Model T, to the sprocket, and then driving the cast malleable iron tracks. Unlike the others, it had some suspension. The frame, that usually held the 4 road wheels, now held a pair of small leaf springs, which the wheels were mounted on each end of. These alterations came with a weight cost though, and it was quickly realised that the 2-speed gearbox couldn't handle, which was now 1.36 tonnes. To remedy this, they installed a 2-speed transfer box between the gearbox and the drive axle, adding a kind of high-low function, essentially giving it 4 forward gears to play with, although one of these gears was semi-redundant, only being used when an obstacle is proving difficult to get over, and you need a bit more torque. The resulting machine is sometimes referred to as the true prototype, for it would form the blueprint for the Mark VI. The only addition they would make from this, for the earlier production models, was the installation of a wood and metal return skid. The next year they would add towing equipment in hopes of it being used as a tractor for the 3.7-inch mounting gun. It didn't work out well, as the power from the engine fought to overcome the additional weight of the howitzer. It could do it, but there was a weak link in the system that couldn't take the strain, the Model T axle. It was being subject to forces almost 3 times what it could handle, resulting in many of them becoming twisted and warped. Fortunately, there was an easy solution. If the car axle couldn't manage it, we'll just use the heavy-duty one from the Ford 1-ton truck. This change was originally meant to be applied to only new vehicles built for this purpose. However, it seems that all new vehicles would be fitted with this instead, as Vickers had started to ramp up production. With the Mark VI proving to be a successful design, the older Mark Vs would find themselves being upgraded to this standard, with the 8 that were in the hands of the MWEE referring to them as the Mark V Star. One of these would be fitted with additional frontal armour, which now provided cover for the crewman as well as a gun shield around the MG mount. Vehicle 5B would become the first and only in-fighter, a newly conceived idea for a carrier that could advance ahead of the infantry providing covering fire. If you're wondering what's the difference between that and the tankette concept, there isn't one, unless you wish to be pedantic. It wouldn't go anywhere though, and that's almost literally. The weight increase reduced its speed from 28 to 24 miles per hour, Whilst that's not too drastic, its performance over rough terrain would drop significantly. Another conversion was the 3-inch mortar carrier. It had to be accompanied by a second carrier which brought the rest of the crew and an ammunition trailer. This had the lower section and base plate mounted on the hull with the rest of the barrel stowed at the back. It is speculated that it could actually be fired like this, but due to the main tube not being attached, its range would be pitifully short, as well as being completely inaccurate. Like the MG carrier, it was supposed to be dismounted. A lot of trailers were experimented with. These were 4 large road wheels on leaf spring suspension holding them onto a frame. They could also be fitted with tracks for heading across country. There was a limber for the 3.7-inch gun, a simple box for ammunition or supplies, a radio trailer, and even a mobile shelter for forward operating officers to call down artillery fire from, with its built-in radio. One of the stranger ones was the troop transport trailer, with its 2 pairs of seats mounted back to back. It wasn't a comfortable ride to say the least. The suspension was stiff, the seats were barely padded, and you were completely exposed. If you were in the rear-facing seats, you would be surprised by every sharp rut and bump that you couldn't see coming, and it's not much better for the forward-facing positions either, as you got a face full of exhaust and the tracks flinging mud at you. Originally intended to carry dismounted cavalry troops, it would later find itself joined by a 20mm Oerlikon anti-tank gun, mounted on another smaller trailer, forming an odd anti-tank team train. In either configuration, the Carden-Loyd's engine wasn't powerful enough to haul these at any significant speed. Naturally, this led to a project to increase its power. One of these entailed the assistance of Harry Ricardo's engine development company. Ricardo already made the improved header for the Model T engine, the one that gave it an extra 0.5 horsepower. With a bit of tinkering, he was able to bring the output up from 20.5, sometimes mentioned as 22.5 due to the RAC system, to 26 horsepower. This would come at a cost, not just in parts and material, but other performance aspects. Its running temperature was higher, as was its maintenance requirements. The other option, of course, was an engine swap, of which they considered the following. The Austin 12 horsepower, a much smaller engine that produced... Take a guess. If you said 12 horsepower, you obviously haven't been listening. It's 27 horsepower. The Coventry Climax 20 horsepower. I couldn't find out which exact engine this was, so I can't tell you what its real power or size is. And some 4-cylinder Armstrong Siddeley engine that produced 25 horsepower. Each of these choices would require a major redesign to the vehicle to accommodate it, and for some unknown reason, the Armstrong Siddeley would be the one chosen. I was unable to find more information on this engine. Armstrong Siddeley mostly made 6-cylinder engines for its cars, but did produce one line called the 414, 4 being the cylinder count and 14 being its tax rate. Whilst that vehicle was produced up until 1929, my main sources suggest that the engine was not a standard commercial type, so at best I can hypothesize it was possibly an unproduced variant of the said engine. Well, whatever the case may be, the engineers at Vickers Carden-Loyd decided to take this opportunity to completely overhaul the design, giving it slightly sloped armour that now fully covered the crew. The suspension was also revised, replacing the wooden skid with a pair of return rollers. The idler was brought level with the drive sprocket, and heavier duty tracks were added to help with the additional weight. Initially, a pair of prototypes were built. Whilst one was kept for testing on Salisbury Plain, the other saw its trials in Egypt. The new design proved to be heavily flawed, but 4 production models would be produced that did somewhat relieve the issues of fumes and heat building up inside the enclosed hull. But nothing could be done about the excessive noise levels reverberating around the enclosed space, or to stop the violent pitching caused by the repositioned idler. It also failed to fix the original problem it was made for, as the added weight of all this negated any benefit of the more powerful engine. This model would be referred to as the Mark 6A. It was built by the Royal Ordnance Factory, who would receive a further order for 10 more. These they would deliver, but with some alterations. Most of them were small things to help alleviate the issues that the A had. The size of the exhaust muffler was increased, in an attempt to reduce the noise problem, although it would still persist. Most importantly, they moved the idler back to its original position, and the vehicles would be named Mark 6B. Despite only being made in 1931, by 1935, all 16 of the A's and B's would be withdrawn from service due to transmission failures. Before that though, back in 32, a pair of 6A's would be tested out with a more powerful Ford Model A engine. Known to produce 40 horsepower, it may also be shown as 24, RAC tax rating striking again. Even with the additional weight of a hinged roof that could fold out into 4 pieces, the performance was greatly increased. notably in its hill climbing. Despite the pitching issue caused by the higher idler, it got a glowing report. The British Army didn't order any though. In fact, 1932 would be when they stopped ordering anymore, and would be the start of the slow process of phasing the Carden-Loyd out. This Mark 6 Star, as it was named, would instead find its place on the export market. But that's the topic for the next episode. There would be one final prototype in 33 though. It was also powered by the Model A engine that was offset to the left of the vehicle. It was fully enclosed, producing much less noise for the crew. The driver sat in the centre with the gunner to his right and had one less return roller. The biggest difference was that it was bigger. Now it had a third crewman position, angled at 45 degrees behind the gunner. Due to its over 2.5 ton weight though, it didn't do very well in its trials. Over 300 Lloyd carriers would be purchased by the Army. Some sources cite 325, whilst there are unconfirmed claims that it was as high as 348. Now, you remember back a few chapters ago where I mentioned the press all being wrong about how they were to be used. Well, that's because the Army didn't really know what to do with them really. Don't look surprised, this is the British Army we're talking about here. Now yes, it was designed as a machine gun carrier, sometimes a mortar carrier and occasionally a gun tractor, whilst being intended to be used by the infantry to rapidly relocate their machine guns. The Royal Tank Corps and the MWEE would retain most of them for exercises. Here, they were initially used as reconnaissance vehicles for the medium tank units, something that they weren't very well suited for as they require a trailer to carry the radio set. They would also be used as proxy light tanks for many years, until the RTC had enough actual ones. In 34, they were even used in lieu of infantry tanks, as those wouldn't be developed for another few years. Their first use in actual service with British forces would be in 1930 in India, during some trouble in Waziristan. It wasn't a full campaign, but a counter-radar operation. A pair of tropicalised carriers, with improved cooling and a canvas canopy to keep the sun off, were deployed to provide flank protection for the artillery, or to deliver the MGs to a high point overlooking the road. It's unknown if they actually saw any fighting, but they did prompt the commander of the operation to request more light tanks to be sent to the region, as he saw their potential. Now, this is their only confirmed action in British service. But those of you who like to scour the Tanks Encyclopedia archives may have seen the claim that around 200 of them would be deployed by the BEF and see action in Belgium. I could find no source to corroborate this though, and it's most likely that the carriers, long considered obsolete, were kept back for training before being scrapped for material. Except, there is that one little mystery. No, that can wait for the next episode, where I'll go into its service for other nations. I'll tell you about its time on the front lines in the jungles of South America, about the weapon that the Belgians mounted onto it, and even the time it would be turned on its creators. You don't want to miss it. So before I finish the video out, as its legacy in Britain is not quite over, please subscribe if you want to see more, hit the bell to be notified when that episode comes out, and like this video if you found it interesting. I'm still new to all this, so if you have any constructive feedback for me, comment below, and even if you don't, please leave a comment anyway, just to help poke the algorithm. Thank you for watching. Now let us conclude this story. Although the Carden-Loyd Carrier didn't see much service with the British Army, its successors undoubtedly did. Throughout the 30s, Vickers Carden-Loyd would continue developing the carrier idea, by making them bigger, with a more powerful engine, and drastically improved suspension. Initially, this was as several specialised lines, such as the Scout Carrier, the Mortar Carrier, and even a Cavalry Carrier. Eventually, all this would result in Vickers creating a single model that could do it all. It could be a machine gun carrier, a scout, mortar, or an anti-tank rifle carrier, transport ammunition or troops to the front and casualties away from it. It could tow a light gun while carrying its crew on board. If Mike Sparks had been around back then, I'm sure he would say that if you stuck wings on it, it would fly. And I'm not exaggerating on how successful this vehicle was. Even today, it is still one of the most produced armoured vehicles of all time, with approximately 113,000 of them being built. It was loved across the Commonwealth and even retained the idea of using commercially available parts, making it ridiculously cheap to make. It was essentially one carrier to rule them all, a machine that truly lived up to its name: universal.